The bench was a black smear against November, frost beating on the slatted wood, like a constellation of small, indifferent stars. Her hands were wrapped around a paper cup that did little against the November wind. The heat had long since bled away. People hurried past in scarves and earbuds, their conversations a muffled tide she didn't have the energy to rise against. She had been told for 12 years that she was nothing more than a hollow promise, a body whose value had been measured in the absence of a child. That judgment had settled into her bones, until she no longer recognized the face in the mirror. She waited there because waiting had become a habit as automatic as breathing. Waiting meant the day had shape. It kept her from floating away into something worse than freezing. If anyone asked why she had not gone to the shelter, she would have had no clear answer. Perhaps it was the name she still whispered under her breath like an old prayer. Clara softly insisting that the word belonged to someone who still existed. He saw her, because there was no other reason to have stopped than the force of a sudden decision. Elias Ward's brakes hissed, the hum of his minivan folding into the late-night hush. He had 5 small faces in his house, and a list of things to do that would not wait for a stranger's trouble. Still, he put the van into park and walked the distance to the bench. "You're freezing," he said. His voice was simple, practical, as if he were offering a lid for a pot. There was none of the performance of a rescuer in him. It was a man who had learned how to solve immediate problems: boil water, fold a blanket, calm a child, because 5 of them would not tolerate indecision. She glanced up. His hair was wind-tangled, his coat speckled with flour from the kitchen. He carried the domestic like an apron, not a shield. There was a soft, exhausted brightness in his eyes. She had seen brightness like that before. Once, in kinder seasons. It made the hollow behind her ribs ache. She began, and stopped. The words did not want to be made into sentences. The bruise at the edge of her jaw showed when she turned her face, small, angry purple, that had already begun to hide beneath the pale skin that had learned to look away. He looked at it for only a breath, and then, as if checking the weather, asked, "Do you want something warm? I can get you soup." He did not ask where she had come from. He did not press. He only asked one small, sane thing, and the sound of it, ordinary chirty, was a kind of miracle. She said, "Yes." The minivan was full of the smells of living. Peanut butter on the upholstery, a school backpack with a band of glitter dried into its seams, a small crust of jam on the seatbelt. As they drove, she watched headlight halos swallow the dark, thought about how the world reduced people to possibilities in a single evening, sigh one to ignore or help. Elias pulled up to a modest house that bore the marks of habitation. A shoe rack so full it bowed, a row of tiny winter coats hanging from hooks, the faint stomp of routines formed out of necessity. Inside, the house was a collage of small economies. 5 plates were wet from dinner cooling on the table. A braid of blonde hair lay across a counter where someone had fallen asleep while reading, and the quiet chaos of a home that ran on love and exhaustion made itself known in every warm corner. A little hand reached for her sleeve the moment the door closed. "Hi," said the handholder, Asher, who was the oldest at 9, a practical boy with a new gap between his front teeth and eyes that watched like a cautious dog. He measured her with a quick, almost professional skepticism. Theo was a tangle of energy, 7, who greeted Clara, as if every adult should be subject to immediate testing. Jude, 6, slid off the couch to show a folded paper drawing, heavy with black lines and a crooked sun. Leia was 4. She held herself like a small, serious librarian. Hair tied back with a band that chewed into her scalp. Eliat, 2, clung to Elias's leg like a barnacle. They looked at her, then at Elias, then back at her again. Children have a precise way of smelling danger and inconvenience the way adults smell coffee. They can tell when plans might have to change. Elias introduced her, as simply as one might announce a new recipe. "This is Clara," She's gonna stay in the spare room tonight. We'll see how it goes. The children accepted the answer the way children accept most things. With a shrug and a small compromise, they were tired. They had seen things that had worn them thin. And survival teaches kids a kind of swift forgiveness. She watched them unroll around the house like little planets finding orbit. In that orbit she felt something beginning that she had not let herself name. A warmth that was not simply the kitchen radiator. Days, once they knew her name, folded into a rhythm. She did not say much at first. Silence had been a tool of her marriage, a way of marking her compliance. In Elias's house, silence was a space to be filled with work. She made lunches with an efficiency that astonished her. The peanut butter spread a little less raggedly, the grapes packed in small bags. She learned each child's peculiar preference for crusts. The way Theo liked his sandwich cut diagonal, and Jude preferred his square. She learned that Asher liked his hair combed to the left on Tuesdays, because it made him feel older, and that Ellie had a song she sang whenever she wanted to be picked up. They nicknamed her Miss C, before she knew which syllable to accept. The name was given in the privacy of a kitchen, when Leia, who had been reticent for a week, let Clara braid the frayed ends of her hair. Leia breathed out a sound she hadn't in months, and stuck to Miss C like glue. The title sat on Clara's tongue like a new coin, strange, but not unwelcome. Before the night on the bench had become a string of repeating days, she had been allowed to sleep in the spare room. It was a small closet of a place with a window that opened to a line of maples. Her suitcase had been an old thing with a mottled brass lock, containing only a locket pressed against a folded photograph, and a sweater that still smelled faintly of hospital antiseptic. She kept the locket shut in the drawer. Sometimes she would touch it and feel the tremor of a remembered refusal. How a husband could turn disappointment into a steady weapon, repeating his contempt until it became a fact of the marriage. He had told her she had nothing to offer without children. That accusation had been the measure of his cruelty, reducing her to a lack. It followed her into shelters and the cold streets, a ghost that leaned on her shoulder at night. For 12 years, that refrain had been written into everything. Greetings, arguments, the empty spaces of photographs. She had lost a child once, Miss Garris. That wound had been a private, searing thing that magnified the barbs that were aimed at her. After the miscarriage, things changed. The cruelty hardened. A new violence rose in the interstices of their ordinary life. She had taken a risk, and then vanished from it. A choice assisted by a doctor who believed she deserved safety. She had been declared dead by people who had looked only at paperwork and rumor. The fact of her non-existence had been a mercy in the way that burned paper might be. It erased her address, her obligations, but it did not erase the old words. In Elias's house, she began to relearn what small acts could do. She learned to move in the kitchen, so the coffee would be waiting before the children noticed they needed it. She learned to braid Leia's hair without twitching at the scent of someone else's cologne. She learned the patience of waiting while a child explained a drawing narrow lines that meant a storm, a circle that meant a missing person, and a heart that meant longing. The job at the bookstore came because Nora Finch closed the shop early one Saturday for a health appointment, and Clara stayed in the back to count till receipts. Nora was a woman whose hands were permanently dusted in ink, and whose laugh could be heard 3 doors down. She had watched Clara fold a stack of flyers, with the attentive curiosity of someone who collected stories, the way thrifty people collect jars. "You know your way around paper," Nora said. "Half an observation, half an offer. You ever work a register?" Clara told her a little. She did not tell the whole, only the parts that fit into sentences without strangling them. Nora hired her for 3 afternoons and a Saturday story hour. The bookstore smelled like good paper and lemon oil. There was a small bell that announced customers, a stack of notebooks with elastic bands, a mug shaped like a whale. Clara found peace in the cadence of the register's clicks, in the loyalty of repeat customers who wanted a recommended read. The money she brought home was small and honest and, for the first time in a long time, hers. The children were quick to notice. Asher told his friends at school that Miss C worked with books that smell like the ocean. Jude drew pictures that included Clara as a tall figure with long hands that helped people cross rivers. Leia, who had barely spoken of her mother for months, would hum while she played with a plastic tea set aside for imaginary mothers. Ellie would crawl into Clara's lap and fall asleep like a pet against a rib. The house, in its way, stitched up some of her raggedness. Bread burned at least twice a week because the oven's timer confused Elias, who could never remember which button said start. Someone misplaced the library card every Thursday. They learned to make up songs for the long car rides. They found rituals for the small things: coffee cups, lined up by the sink like small soldiers, a shoe sorting ceremony that turned into a game. Clara found that tending these things filled a fissure inside her. She hadn't known, was still raw. There was tenderness that was not invasive. Elias never asked her to speak of her past in front of the children. He gave her space that could have been mistaken for indifference, if you were trained to expect cruelty. Instead, it was a kind of respect. He would sit at the kitchen table with crumpled bills and school forms and the open map of their month. He listened to her when she described a book she loved, leaning his chin into his palm, as if hearing her read aloud was a brief vacation from the daily demands of 5 children. He noticed details: how she folded napkins in a particular way, how her hand hovered over Jude's drawing before she smiled. The attractions between them were shy at first, a look that lasted a beat too long when they passed each other the coffee pot, the way their hands brushed as they reached for the broom, an exchange where neither would name the thing both sensed. They were not dramatic. Romance in a household ruled by PTA forms and homework is practical. A shared load, a trade-off on who would get up at 2 a.m. with a fever, the tacit agreement that someone would sit through the recital despite a million other things to do. There were moments of private light: Elias humming the lullaby he had sung for his late wife, Clara singing it back in a quiet, steadier key. Once, she found a small white bracelet near the sink and slipped it on without comment. He watched her puttered in the kitchen and thought about what courage it took for someone to allow themselves to be known again. Healing is incremental. It is not a startling arc, but a handful of small victories. One Thursday evening, Jude cried because his drawing had become a tangle of scribbles when he had attempted to add a father figure. He shoved it away, embarrassed, and the sound of that embarrassment sharp and vulnerable cut across Clara. She sat beside him, on the floor of the living room, where the light fell like a map on the carpet. She took the paper carefully between 2 fingers, smoothed the creases, and asked him to tell the story again. Jude's voice was small at first, then grew confident as he described a house with a huge tree and a family, with many plates to wash, and one giant dog, who ate the socks. They folded the paper into a little boat and left it on the windowsill, so that, in the morning, the sunlight would pretend the boat had sailed somewhere safe. To Jude, that small ritual mattered far more than anyone at a PTA meeting might imagine. To Clara, it was a stitch. She began, in the quiet hours when the house slept, to practice a new speech. It was a rehearsal of small sentences that she would one day say aloud to herself in front of the mirror. My name is Clara. I earned my money. I make sandwiches the right way for Theo. They were silly and brave, and gradually grew into a chorus she could hum under her breath without trembling. Nora became a steady presence. She gave Clara a small taxidermied whale for the children to look at. It's a metaphor, she said, and she offered practical counsel on how to apply for a part-time day at the community center. Mabel, the neighbor, came by to babysit an afternoon. Mabel had been a nurse and had a way of noticing bruises, the way seismographers notice tremors. She did not ask. She made soup and left a basket of bread on the porch. Once she patted Clara's hand and said, "You're doing good, love." as if the phrase meant nothing more than the truth. It was not all light. Some nights the old words arrived like a rain that washed out the roads. Clara would wake with the sensation of being judged by the shadow of a man she had once called husband. Some mornings she would find herself turning the locket in her fingers, feeling the small dent where a coin had struck it years ago. The locket contained a picture of herself from before. Hair long and untempered, smiling at a place they had gone on an unimportant Sunday. That smile felt fragile, like porcelain in a box. Slowly, it regained structure. A winter afternoon in the bookstore. A customer came in with a magazine under her arm. The headline caught Clara's eye. A local entrepreneur, with a polished grin and a new charity gala. She looked at the face and it felt like a trap door opened beneath her. The man's jawline was familiar. At the same time, Nora knelt to tie Ellie's shoelace and hummed a song, unaware of the storm a page could bring. Clara put the magazine face down and kept folding. She felt her throat tighten, a reaction that was more biological than anything else. A small picture, innocent to the world, could have the force of a verdict. It was the tiniest thing in advertisement for a public speaking engagement, but it was enough. For 12 years he'd drilled into her that she was nothing without children. For 2.5 years the world had believed she was gone. Now, to see him, in the light of public adoration, smiling as if his hands had done nothing cruel, made the old hurt flare like an open wound. She fled the shop before she had arranged her words into goodbye. Elias was on his way to pick her up. They had a meeting about the kids' winter concert. The parking lot was cold and bright. She stood very still when he climbed into the driver's seat. "You okay?" he asked, sensing the change like someone who knows when a child has broken a toy. She could not tell him all of it, not yet. The story was too heavy and felt, foolishly, like evidence. He put his hand on hers for a long, steadying second. "You don't have to," he began, but she cut him off. "I wasn't dead by accident," she said, and the way the sentence left her mouth made it sound smaller than it was. The park's light made his face pale. "I left. I disappeared because I needed to be safe." He? Maikeru wain he. The name felt like a stone dropped between them. Elias's eyes did not look away. "Do you want me to call Dr. Mororo?" he asked. He already knew the name because he had seen Dr. Evelyn Mororo around town, a woman with an urgent compassion and the kind of calm that testified to inner conviction. She had been helpful once. She had held the point at which a life needed to be cut from its old stitches. Clara nodded, feeling small and enormous at the same time. She had not spoken the full story to many people. Some truths keep you at a remove from life until they are told. The choice to speak them aloud is the first step toward reclaiming a place at the table. Before they called, a different arena threatened to collapse into them. The children piled into the car with their winter hats, laughing as if the world couldn't be bigger than who had the warmer mittens. For a moment, sitting between the pile of small bodies and the steering wheel, Clara had the sensation of being held by gravity. The life she had been told she could not have: family, warmth, a place to bake bread and scold a child gently, was in the seat beside her, and in the voices that argued about who got the front seat. She let herself lean into it for a beat and, without meaning to, touched Elias's sleeve. There were warnings. Coming forward would not be the end of the story. Michael Wynne wore a public mask of benevolence. He gave to institutions, spoke at panels, smiled for community cameras. He was practiced at performance. She knew too well how the world mistakes surface for truth. She also knew, with muscle memory and a doctor's quiet assurances, that there were records, medical notes, photographs, witnesses who had been present when the decision was made to get her out. She had been frightened into disappearing, yes, but she had not been silenced by everyone. Some had taken notes and kept them safe. They made the call. Dr. Evelyn Morora's voice on the other end of the line was a thing of bone and kindness. She remembered the night, no details. No how to. Only the shape of it. The urgency. She was a woman who believed documentation mattered because truth has a way of refusing to be rewritten when people lay down their names. She said she would come to the house with what she had, and that there were other people, the neighbors, Mabel, Nora, who had kept minutes of what they knew. Clara felt a little of the world's weight shift off her shoulders. It did not feel like vindication. It felt like armor. That night, when the children were tucked into beds, and the house quieted into a thin thread of Elias and Clara sat across from one another, at the little kitchen table. The lamp cast a pool of yellow, that made the air look like honey. There was a quiet domesticity to it. The remains of Theo's sandwich in a Tupperware, a stack of school forms, the milk jug, marked with a Sharpie note, for Friday's soccer game. Elias rolled a pen between his fingers. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "I thought I had to," she said. "For so long, the world said I did." Her voice did not break. It had lost the habit of crying in public. Instead, it carried the brittle strength of someone who had learned to keep a house standing in a storm. Elias leaned forward. "We're a team here. You're with us." They spoke then of practicalities, what it would look like to put together the materials Dr. Mororo would bring, to let Nora write a statement, to ask Mabel what she had seen. Elias had a quiet way with lists. His brain reduced chaos to actionable items, and that felt, perversely, like a form of tenderness. It was not bridal romance. It was a man saying he would hold your hand while you did the thing you needed to do to be safe. The decision to come forward did not come all at once. It was instead a set of small moments that lined up, until they formed an arrow. Jude's quiet insistence that the family should know where they belong. Leia's mornings when she braided Clara's hair, and hummed, as if naming a ritual. The hum of Nora's shop where customers spoke their gratitude like currency. The way Mabel had left bread in the cold, and said nothing more. These were the reasons a person chooses to step out of hiding. When the first public inkling arrived, it was not with fireworks. It was a photograph in a local paper, Michael Wynne, smiling beneath a headline about a gala for the Children's Hospital. The image needed no caption to stab. Clara felt the old rusted lock in her chest uncoil with a rumble like thunder. She had been gone long enough that his appearances in public should not have mattered. But the camera had a way of telling stories that seemed to transmute the past into a lie. Elias grabbed her hand. His fingers were warm and steady. The kind of steady that meant someone who had been up at 2 a.m. with a fever. "We'll do this," he said. His voice was not loud. It was a plan. She thought about the children's faces, Theo, with his jolt of jokes, Jude with his heavy black sun drawings, Leia and her small librarian seriousness, Asha's practical heroism, Ellie's sleepy smile. They had given her a place to wake. They had not asked to become embroiled in adult wars. She hated the idea of exposing them to the fray. She also knew that silence had a cost. It legitimized the old accusation that she was nothing without children. She would not let his reputation continue to trap other people in a flattering lie. The next morning, the house moved differently. There was a tightness at the edges. Elias's phone calls to Dr. Mororo were businesslike. They did not speak about revenge or drama. The plan was to gather truth and present it as what it was. Evidence that a life had been harmed, and that truth required witnesses. Clara felt fear like a tidal thing, high and cold, and inevitable. She also felt the slow, steady burn of a conviction she had not felt since those first small jobs at the bookstore. She wanted to be more than a rumor. She wanted to be seen as a person who had the right to space and to safety. Preparation involved small humiliations and practical chores. She handed over the locket to Dr. Mororo, private relic entrusted to someone with a steady hand. She recounted certain events in medical rooms and legal offices, but never the ways she had been made to disappear. The legalities were a scaffolding. She insisted they not be the main story. The main story, she believed, was her life at the table, making sandwiches, folding sweaters, answering the phone for a child's teacher. That story had been the thing he had tried to erase. It was also what she intended to reclaim. People came forward in small numbers. Nora wrote a letter that began with mundane details: Clara's steady attendance at story hour. The way Ellie took to her lip and ended with a statement of character. Mabel testified what she had seen in the neighborhood, the small things that, when arranged together, formed an image that contradicted the polished public face of a charity man. Dr. Maroro collected medical notes, photographs, and the blunt, unromantic facts that sometimes speak more clearly than roaring speeches. There were quiet moments that belonged to the two of them. Elias, humming while fixing a slowly dying lamp, Clara reading at the kitchen table, until the streetlights made tiny pools on the floor. Their affection grew like bread to little kneadings, that made the whole more substantial. Once, after a late night of forms, Elias found Clara staring out the window, with a small, old worry fixed on her face. "You said your first real kitchen was in this house, right?" he asked. It was one of his odd attempts at lightness. She laughed soft and incredulous. "First in years, and now you have 5 critics who will never fail to taste test your bread." She looked at him then, and something passed between them that neither named. It was not a promise. It was the gravity of two people who had been given the chance to choose one another's company in the small, mundane theater of everyday life. That choice would, in time, become the foundation for a future, if they let it. Then the past came back into the light, with a single, careless flourish. It was a Sunday afternoon at the park. The children were in a pile of blankets, reading comics with the thud happiness of kids allowed to drop into play after the week. Clara had been holding Ellie in her lap, fingers absently tracing the pattern on the blanket, when a voice called out across the field. There was a man in a suit, surrounded by cameras, laughing in a way polished for public consumption. The way he moved, smooth and confident, sent a cold shock through her. For a breath, she felt the world constrict. The man was Michael Wynne. He had not expected to find her. People who build reputations on carefully edited faces rarely learned the geography of the people they have wronged. But here he was, and the cameras hummed like flies. He was exactly as the world knew him in public. Charming, comfortable, a man with causes and a smile. He walked past the blankets with the carriage of someone who owns the right to be seen. Clara's hand tightened around Ellie. The child lifted her face and blinked, unaware that the air had changed. Leah looked up and frowned. Some instinct told her that change of weather meant trouble. Elias stood, muscles coiling, not because he wanted to fight but because he knew the shape of danger. Michael Wynne looked at Clara for a second, that felt like a private rerun of years of cruelty. He smiled a social smile, the quick flicker meant to acknowledge a stranger. He did not stop. He did not appear to recognize anyone who could complicate the portrait he showed the cameras. It was a small contempt, intentional or not, and it landed like a stone. Clara felt something break and rebuild all at once, rage and fear braided together, fierce and resolute. She wanted to run, to hide, to tell the children they were safe. Elias put his hand on her back and guided her to a bench. The park around them didn't notice. Life is protective in little ways. A dog chased a ball. A couple bickered about ice cream flavors. A child shrieked at the top of her lungs. The ordinariness continued as if nothing had happened. She breathed and then, steadier than she had expected, reached into her pocket and took out the crumpled paper that had been waiting for moments like this. It was precisely the sort of flimsy thing that terrorizes a person who has been trained to be small. A flyer from a gala, a printed photograph of Michael Wynne, with a child's charity check in his hands. She smoothed it, and held it like a banner. The world, from outside, looked the same. Inside, small things matter most. "You need to tell someone," Elias said, and the tone of his voice made it impossible to mistake urgency for melodrama. She nodded. They did not call for vengeance. They called for truth. The decision to take the small, loud evidence of his public life, and unspool it into memory and formal testimony, was not a step taken lightly. It meant a second round. Hearings, stories, set into microphones, the possibility of defamation and the thin, brittle dance of public exposure. It meant dragging into a light that could be harsh and unforgiving. The same man who had learned to make kindness his brand. That night, the house held its breath. The kids were asleep, wrapped around loveys and stuffed animals. The radio whispered in the background. Like a temple, Clara sat at the kitchen table and stared at a stack of papers. Nora's letter sat on top like a flag. Mabel had left a small note, with a number for a community advocate. Dr. Maurora's messages had been factual and kind. Elias sat across from her, and reached across the table to cover her hand with his. He did not make promises, he said small things. We'll do what needs to be done, that were the substance of practical love. In that quiet, Clara felt the shape of a life she had once been told she did not deserve. It was not a lightning bolt of fairy tale affection, it was the slow accumulation of 1,000 mundane decisions. Paying the electric bill, reading one more bedtime story, learning to braid Leia's hair so it did not pull at the scalp. The next morning began like any other, with cereal spilled in backpacks in disarray. But there was an undercurrent, an attention that can be felt in small domestic rhythms. When a grave thing sits near the surface, decisions were made. They would contact a lawyer. Dr. Maurora would gather her notes. Nora agreed to give a statement. They would not seek spectacle. They would seek the bare bones of truth, the sort that can be backed up by signatures and photographs and people willing to say what was true. Clara walked to the window and watched the maple leaves shiver in the wind. She thought of the woman she had been, the one who had stood on the bench and allowed the world to look at her as if she were a ghost. She felt the slow, surprising lift in her chest, as a new sense of agency came into being. I can make a sandwich my way, she thought suddenly, and the smallness of it felt like healing. It was a ridiculous thing to be grateful for, but the small things are the ones that start a life again. As she tied her apron and set about the breakfast ritual, the house hummed into motion. Theo practiced his jokes at the table. Jude explained very seriously why his drawing was a solar system. Asher packed the snack box with care, and selected his oldest sweater like a minor costume. Leia asked to have her hair in 2 braids. Ellie sneezed, then laughed. Clara braided Leia's hair and hummed a lullaby that had been given to her in pieces. Over time, a patchwork of songs stitched together from late-night shifts and community. Her fingers moved with confidence and tenderness, and that small confidence translated into other things. A steadying of her voice when she dropped off a stack of forms. To Dr. Mur, a new boldness when she accepted a paycheck at the end of a bookstore shift. Each act of competence was a brick in the foundation of a life that did not require permission. They did not know yet what would come of taking a man's public life, and asking whether the private truth differed from what his speeches proclaimed. They only knew there were people who would stand with Clara, and that the children, by the way they claimed her presence so fiercely, had already done some of the healing for her. In their small rituals they had given her a place to anchor her worth. In their trust, she learned that being wanted was not a transaction but a reciprocal claim. That day, they gathered what they could. Dr. Moreau came by with an envelope. Nora came with a cup of tea and a steady look, and Mabel brought a list of neighborhood dates. Each a small witness. Elias arranged the papers in stacks, and made a plan that involved evenings devoted not to fear, but to checking the boxes of truth. They spoke quietly about consequences, about what it would cost to disrupt a public persona. Clara listened and felt, for the first time in years, that her life had more than one possible ending. At sundown, before the children tumbled into sleep, Clara stood by the window and looked at the bench where she had once been found. The frost had gone from the slats, and the November air had taken on the pale promise of early winter. She imagined herself walking across that park, not as someone who shrank at the margin of life but as a person who had been given permission to claim a place at the center of a small, ordinary table. The thought felt absurd and powerful at the same time. Elias came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her shoulders. He smelled of coffee and bread, and the clean exhaustion of a man who had learned the shape of his children's faces. "Whatever comes next," he said into her hair, "we get to choose how to answer it." Clara closed her eyes, and for the first time since the bench, she did not imagine the world as a place that would only ever judge her for absence. She had been rejected for being childless, used as a measure of someone else's failure. In the quiet household, among mismatched plates and chipped mugs, and the steady chorus of small talk, she felt, for the first time in a long while, like a person who could choose what to keep and what to leave behind. They moved forward carefully. Weeks of preparing became a rhythm in the margins of ordinary life. Elias filling out school forms at night, while Clara stapled statements and labeled envelopes. Nora printing copies in the back room of the bookstore and making sure the handwriting looked as if it had never been taught to hide. Mabel, as steady as the porch light she kept lit, sat with Clara once a week and offered plain sentences. "You don't owe him your silence." That sounded both obvious and like small miracles. There was an early moment of quiet, necessary ritual that Clara had not expected to matter. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the spare room and took the locket from the drawer. The photograph inside had faded at the edges. The smile in it looked like someone trying on happiness. For a long time the locket had been heavy with shame. Now it felt like a relic she could choose to interpret differently. She pressed it to her chest and said, out loud, 3 small sentences she had been practicing. "My name is Clara. I make sandwiches the right way for Theo. I belong here." Saying them felt less like proclamation, and more like the plumbing of a safe house, the pipes that made sound possible again. The call for the first hearing came across as a letter mailed in sober type. The courtroom was not what she had imagined from the movies. It was smaller, quieter, full of furniture, worn soft by use, and the muffled echo of footsteps. People slid into wooden chairs and arranged themselves as if setting a table. The children came, 2 at a time, in the care of Nora and Mabel, each wrapped in a coat stitched by someone who knew that warmth could be literal and not just metaphor. Clara felt a granular anxiety that morning, the kind that sits at the base of your teeth. She wore a scarf Elias had tied for her, and she kept hold of the locket in her pocket. The entry into the courtroom felt like walking into a photograph. Lights too bright, the air smelling like lemon cleaner and old paper. Michael Wynne was already there, his public face in place as if he were about to make a speech on philanthropy instead of sitting as a defendant. For a second, the old reflexes tried to arrange her words into smaller boxers so they would fit into what people expected of a woman who had been harmed. She refused them. Her life at the kitchen table had taught her that the small, ordinary things were evidence too. Dr. Evelyn Maroro spoke first, not with theatricality but with the iron, clear detail of someone who had recorded things carefully. She called out dates, described notes she had made, and showed a photograph that had been taken in a hospital room, taken, she explained, by the single light of concern, kept because truth was a brittle thing that needed witnesses. There were nods from a few jurors. The photograph did not have to be dramatic to hold weight, it simply existed. Nora's testimony came with a different tone, the cadence of someone who worked with stories and noticed small consistencies. She spoke of Clara's shifts at the bookstore, of the way she read to children and kept track of time, and of the day she found Clara hunched over the register, palms raw from counting change. Nora's voice was patient and precise. She volunteered nothing that did not illuminate the reality of a woman who belonged not just to a file, but to a community. Mabel's words were short, like the sentences of a nurse who had learned to preserve dignity by choosing smaller facts to state out loud. She recounted seeing Clara's face on a certain afternoon, the way bruises had clustered, and then stood out like a map of a wrong. She did not speak of pain. She spoke of pattern. It was the pattern that mattered. The defense tried to turn the glare outward. Michael Wynn's lawyer had cultivated a style of gentle incredulity, careful doubt cast like a veil. Cross-examinations came like a wind that tried to ruffle the edges of testimonies, to make them seem less certain. But the small things held. Dr. Maroro's records were dated and signed. The bookstore receipts placed Clara in the community over time. Mabel's notes had been kept in a drawer and signed on a date that could be corroborated. There were no grand theatrics, but there were enough small, intersecting things to make the polished public narrative wobble. When Clara's turn to speak came, it was not prepared speech so much as a simple alignment of facts, and the careful placement of a person into a story that had once been allowed to erase her. She did not reinvent herself as a heroine. She chose to be honest. She spoke in a voice that trembled and steadied in the same breath, telling of the ways she had been diminished, the names of people who had kept safe what they could, and the small, private evidence that had been kept in drawers, and among colleagues who had trusted the weight of recorded truth. She did not provide lurid details. The judge reminded the room that the case would stand on witness and record, not on sensationalism. Clara agreed with a quiet nod. The record was not about revenge. It was about making true the line between a public persona and private harm. Outside the courtroom, the children clung to each other, and two small talismans. Asher had a pocket Bible from Sunday school he kept for luck. Jude held onto a paper boat they had folded from his drawing. Leah had a braid that wouldn't quite sit right after the morning's hurry. Elias held their hands steady like he held a heavy pan, both practical and sure. The moment the judge called for a recess, Jude ran up and hugged Clara around the knees. "You did it," he whispered, as if the action had been small and domestic enough to be folded into bedtime. The trial stretched into weeks, in a way that made time feel elastic. There were television cameras that tried to find a story of scandal. Clara refused to become a spectacle. She and Elias kept to the smaller constellations. Crate by crate of evidence. The quiet comfort of a dinner made on the stove after a long day. A book read aloud when sleep would not come. The community held a low light around them. People brought casseroles not for drama, but to keep a family fed while they sorted the logistics of being both courageous and exhausted. On the day the jury reached a verdict, the children were sent to school by Nora and Mabel. The house seemed too silent afterward, the kind of silence that holds its breath for a thing it hopes will be ordinary. "It will all be over today," Asher said once, like offering a prayer. Clara sat at the kitchen table with the locket open, touching the picture like an old map, now familiar. Elias sat opposite, and rolled a pen between his fingers, the gesture a kind of ritual for waiting. The courtroom felt heavier than any room in their house. The jurors filed in and took their places, their expressions a slow weather map of concentration. Michael Wynn sat composed, the practiced face that had carried him through Gallison speeches. The judge's voice read the finding in a cadence that made even the breath come out different. "Guilty." The word landed, and then unfolded. Not as a triumphant banner, but as an unbuttoning. A release that let certain muscles in Clara's body unknot. Relief came in small, complicated ways. It did not erase the years of being told she was less. It did not bring back what had been taken. It simply acknowledged that the world recognized a wrong. People sobbed quietly in the Pulak Benji's Nora, Mabel, Dr. Maroro. Among them, Elias's hand closed around Clara's, knuckles white. The children, waiting outside, with Nora's neighborly group, were brought into the hallway of the courthouse, with paper bag lunches, and the uncomprehending, immediate love of kids who know only that the person who keeps them safe, seemed to be safe. The days after the verdict were an adjustment. Reporters wanted statements. Volunteers wanted thank yous. Donors wrote letters in support of causes they hoped might be revised. Clara took a breath, and decided that attention would be used sparingly to make space for others. She declined interviews that promised spectacle, and agreed to one small panel, at the community center where she and Dr. Maroro would speak anonymously about the importance of listening to survivors and the power of records. It was modest, no lights, no glossy set sand. It felt, to her, like the right scale. Life at home remembered itself. They celebrated with small things. A pancake breakfast where Theo insisted on extra syrup and Ellie smeared jam on her chin, in a way that made everyone laugh. They planted bulbs in the small back garden, bulbs that would sleep through the winter, to break into color months later and act. Clara liked, because it was a promise made in faith and dirt, not in speeches. Months passed. The immediate strain of the trial softened into a background ache that sometimes throbbed anniversaries of certain days. A song that conjured memory, but the everyday reclaimed most hours. Clara worked more at the bookstore, took on early mornings to stock shelves, and began leading a children's story hour on Saturdays. Customers who used to ask about the latest novels now asked how she was and then waited for her answer. Her paycheck grew steadier. She learned to sign her own name on rent forms without glancing for permission. Elias and Clara's relationship shifted from the hush of guarded possibility into a daily interweaving that required compromise and humor. They learned how to split the mail, how to decide which of them could take the extra shift, and how to sit in the same room and work through filling out forms without one of them closing up like the shy mollusk they had once been. Their love had begun with an act of compassion, a hot bowl of soup offered to a woman on a bench, but it matured in the slow, unremarkable exchanges that stitched their lives together. Trading off school pickups, trading secrets about who ate the last cookie, trading long looks across a sink full of dishes. The children, who had taken Miss C as part of the geography of their day, continued to anchor her. Leia no longer flinched when Clara moved, because she had braided hair ready. Jude's drawings moved from dark suns to suns, with people in them. Asher took to helping Clara with the register at the bookstore now and then, and had an earnest way of asking customers about their favorite books that made people buy more than they intended. Ellie, small and insistent, began to set the napkins at the table in a row, as if preparing a congregation for service. It was not long before talk in the small circles around them grew into something quieter than gossip and invitation. Elias, who had never been theatrical about romance, one night washed dishes until the kitchen was warm and the sink quiet. He dried his hands on a towel and turned to Clara as if he were answering a question he had been thinking about folding into his life for months. "We don't have to make a big thing of it," he said, careful, like a man who measured the weight of his words. "But if you'd want to, if you'd..." He stopped, as if letting the sentence finish itself. Clara looked at him, and the light above the table made small planets of the flour dust on the counter. "I'd like that," she said. Her voice sounded ordinary and, because of all they had gone through, brave. They decided on something modest. The children would be at the center, literally and figuratively. They spoke together about vows, not the kind that erased the mothers they had lost or the lives already lived, but vows that promised to choose one another daily. They wrote lines that were practical and tender. "I promise to be present for the little things," Elias wrote. "I promise to listen, not to fix," Clara wrote. They planned for cupcakes instead of a tiered cake, for mismatched chairs, for Nora to read a poem about quiet courage. Mabel would make the bread on a late spring afternoon with the garden wakening, and bulbs pushing green fingers through the soil. They stood under a cloth-draped arbor in their backyard. The children were ring bearers, in mismatched sneakers, carrying a small box of petals. Asher wore a sweater he had borrowed from his father's old closet, as if to make himself taller. Theo fidgeted with jokes, on the edge of tears. Jude clutched a drawing he had made of the family, like a house with too many doors. Leia arranged the flowers with solemn dexterity. Ellie, who had been traded from lap to lap all morning, had a smear of jam at the corner of her mouth. They all looked like a life, messy and earnest. Nora read a few lines about chosen family, and the small acts that keep a house from collapsing. Mabel, with her soft, plain voice, said a few words about steady hands. Dr. Maroro, who had come quietly, nodded without a speech. There was no grand proclamation, no attempt to fix what had been broken into perfect symmetry. Instead, people promised to hold the ordinary, with reverence. When they exchanged vows, Elias took Clara's hands, and spoke with the spare language of a man who had learned that words were best when they matched deeds. "I promised to help with the carpenter ants and the math homework," he said, and the children laughed. Clara promised to keep telling the truth about herself. They promised to keep the door open for the messy, beautiful work of living together. Afterward, they ate cupcakes, with slightly crunchy frosting, and sat on picnic blankets, with a playlist that someone had burned onto a CD years ago. Playlist, with songs that had small lines about home. People stayed late, and the dusk was full.